All right, we're going to look at our lesson for today, which is winning the war. So, yesterday we talked about Saratoga being the turning point of the war. We talked a little bit about Benedict Arnold being a traitor. We started things off by talking about the British invasion of New York and how the British captured New York but failed to capture George Washington's army, and then captured Philadelphia but failed to destroy George Washington's army yet again. So today we're going to be looking at what happens after Saratoga, like from Saratoga to the end of the war. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is that the British, following a series of defeats there, decided to move the war to the south, where they thought they had more loyalist support. All right. So let's look at the notes from chapter 4, section 4, and let's talk about a few things that the British did in the South. Okay, so as we said, after Saratoga, the British felt like they had more loyalist support in the South. Remember what a loyalist is. A loyalist is someone who wanted the British to stay in charge. They wanted to remain loyal to the British. They did not want the Americans to declare their independence. And in a lot of ways, the Revolutionary War was not only a war between the Americans and the British, but also a civil war between loyalists and patriots. So the British think they have more loyalist support in the South, and it makes sense that they would go to the South. All right. In the South, Charles Cornwallis was in command of the British. You might remember Charles Cornwallis, his character from the movie The Patriot. He was a real person, and he commanded the British Army in South Carolina. Cornwallis captured Charlestown, which ends up being the greatest victory that the British had during the Revolutionary War. They were able to capture 5,500 American soldiers. And it was at a time when they needed to win. You know, the Americans had won at Saratoga, and the British needed a signature win, and Charlestown was that signature win in the South. As we said, it's the greatest victory for the British. He was able to capture most of South Carolina, but Cornwallis was unable to push into North Carolina because of the militia under the command of Francis Marion, who was also known as the Swamp Fox. All right, remember, what is militia? Okay, when we talk about militia, we need to consider that this is not regular army, The militia is volunteer soldiers, right? The militia is like the characters from the movie The Patriot. Okay, we're talking about Benjamin Martin and his rebels in the movie. Even though those people didn't really exist, they were based on real people like Francis Marion. In fact, Francis Marion serves as the inspiration for Benjamin Martin's character in that movie. All right. Francis Marion is considered the father of modern guerrilla warfare. When you think about guerrilla warfare, you need to think about hit and run, ambushes, things of that nature, hiding behind trees, using the swamps to hide in. Everything that you saw in The Patriot is an example of guerrilla warfare. And as we said, Mel Gibson's character was heavily based on Francis Marion. Banastre Tarleton was the British cavalryman who was charged with finding Francis Marion. And whoever wrote The Patriot was inspired heavily by these men, okay? Tarleton is actually the one who gave Francis Marion his nickname, the Swamp Fox. Here we have Francis Marion. And Francis Marion is based on, Mel Gibson's character, Benjamin Martin, that you see here, is based on Francis Marion, the father of modern guerrilla warfare. Think about all the tactics that he used against the British in that movie. Hit and run, hiding behind trees, ambushes, things of that nature. Banastre Tarleton is the is the real life person that the character Colonel Tavington is based off of in the movie The Patriot. You remember this guy? Okay. This is based off of Banastre Tarleton. And as you can see here from the picture, Banastre Tarleton and his cavalry actually wore green uniforms. But you can see the influence here with the hat that has the heavy plume and everything, and how in the movie his hat has the heavy plume and everything. Okay, they even got it down to those types of details. And Tarleton is actually known for his brutality. He was known for a massacre that happened in which he, killed people that surrendered to him. And it gave rise to the phrase Tarleton's quarter. Now, when you offer your enemy quarter, it means that you take them peacefully and you don't kill them. You offer them room and board, keep them as your prisoner. But Tarleton's quarter meant that when you surrendered, you would be killed. Okay? And so you can see where that influence came from. This is the real live person that Colonel Tavington was based off of. All right. So as the British continued to try to push into the Carolinas and eventually into Virginia, the normally mistake-free Cornwallis makes a big mistake when he camps his men at Yorktown, and he kind of puts himself in a situation where he kind of puts his men at a disadvantage. And the reason they're at a disadvantage is where they choose to set up their camp. Geographically speaking, they're sitting ducks. They choose to camp at a place where the Chesapeake Bay blocks them in on the east, and then a series of rivers blocks them in other areas. So when the Americans come to Yorktown, they are able to trap Cornwallis. When we look at it, he decides to invade Virginia, which is an error, okay? Yorktown, he thought he could evacuate using the Chesapeake Bay if necessary. All right, remember, the Americans don't have a navy, right? So if the British are able to, or if they get in a situation where they need to evacuate from Yorktown, Chesapeake Bay would offer them this ability to do so, except that now the French are helping us. And because the French are helping us, they end up blocking the Chesapeake Bay and preventing the British from escaping. Okay? Cornwallis, being blocked from retreating due to those French forces, was forced to surrender. You can see the date there, October 19th, 1781. After the surrender at Yorktown, peace talks can begin because the British are interested in ending this war. The people back home are tired of fighting the war. They don't see it as a winnable war anymore. And so peace talks really begin in earnest following Yorktown in the months thereafter. All right, so when we talk about this Treaty of Paris, it says 1783, but the peace talks actually started early in 1782, okay? And the Americans had sent John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay to these peace talks. Now, the British saw themselves as a seasoned diplomats, and they didn't think that these Americans would be able to negotiate favorable terms for this treaty. Okay, but they underestimated these American diplomats. And one of the things that John Adams, Franklin, and John Jay decided was that they would not even sit down and talk with these European nations until they had guaranteed America their freedom. Okay, so the Americans demanded full independence be recognized before the peace talks could begin. All right, when the peace talks finally ended, it set the boundary for the United States at the Mississippi River in the west, the Canadian border to the north, and the Florida border to the south. All right, so America became an officially recognized nation, not only by France, but also by Great Britain and Spain. All right. The treaty also said that the British would evacuate their soldiers from the western frontier, but it never mentioned when they would evacuate their soldiers from the western frontier. So they never left. The treaty also said that the Americans were to repay their debts to the British, which they never did. So in a way, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was kind of doomed from the start, and the Americans and the British are going to continue their hostilities towards one another, ultimately fighting another war again in 1812, because the treaty did not specify when British soldiers had to leave, and it did not specify when Americans had to repay their debts. All right? So now that America has won their freedom, they have been recognized by European nations, they have signed a treaty ending the war. What do they do next? What are the challenges that this new country faces? Well, one of the new challenges is that they have to come up with a government. All right? They have to create a functioning government now that they were independent. We still have a functioning government today, and it is governed by the Constitution. But the Constitution was not the first document that was set aside to govern our nation. The first Constitution that we had was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. But that's one of the things that had to be addressed now that we were a new country. Like, what do we do? What kind of government do we create? We had to learn how to incorporate these new feelings of egalitarianism, or the belief in the equality of all people, in that new government, right? Like, we just fought this war where we talked about all men being equal. And we were upset that we did not have equal rights that the British had, that we didn't have representation in Parliament, yet we were being taxed. But at the same time, not everybody in America was equal. We were a slave-holding nation. We were a country that had slaves. And how do we deal with these new feelings of egalitarianism, and yet we allow slavery? These are challenges that had to be addressed, and challenges that wouldn't fully be addressed until after the Civil War. All right? How would Native Americans be addressed? I mean, here we are talking about egalitarianism, and do we treat Native Americans equally at this time in history? No, we didn't. All right, so these challenges were big, and these challenges really questioned whether or not the United States would make it as a country. And ultimately we did, because of the flexibility of the Constitution, which we will get to in future chapters. All right? So I appreciate you guys hanging in there for what I'm sure is a very, very rough first attempt at a video lesson. They will get better as we go, because I was pretty much just winging this one. But I'll be better prepared next time, and we'll try to make it better next time.